of Thailand, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, St. Vincent and the Grenadines is grateful for the opportunity to address this critically important high-level dialogue on financing for development. We align ourselves fully with the statements made by Argentina on behalf of the Group of 77 and by Jamaica on behalf of the Caribbean community. Our collective purpose in this high-level dialogue is to evaluate the status of implementation of the Monterrey Consensus and Doha Declaration on Financing for Development and to consider the tasks ahead. In the time allotted, which does not allow for any single delegation to engage in an exhaustive discussion of all the complex and interconnected issues surrounding development financing, permit me to focus on the implementation of commitments made in financing for development. A key pillar of 2002's Monterrey Consensus was that developed countries would devote a rather modest 0.7% of their national incomes to official development assistance. 2008's Doha Declaration repeated the commitment. 2009's UN Conference on the Financial and Economic Crisis underscored that effective response to the global recession required, quote, an urgent need for all donors to maintain and deliver on their existing bilateral and multilateral official development assistance commitments and targets, unquote, including those made at Monterrey, in Doha, and in Gleneagles. Let us also remember that the idea of devoting 0.7% of national incomes to ODA was not born in Monterrey. In 1970, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 2626, entitled International Development Strategy for the Second United Nations Development Decade. That resolution contained a target of 0.7% in ODA to be achieved by 1975. In the 3.5 decades since the expiration of that 1975 deadline, 0.7% has remained an elusive target, and one that is increasingly emblematic of the shortcomings inherent in our global development partnership. So where are we today in the implementation of these decades-old commitments? In 2010, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, developed countries managed to commit only 0.32% of their incomes to ODA, less than half of their 0.7% commitment. Yet this delivery of a mere 46% of pledged assistance has been hailed today as something of a positive achievement. My delegation would respectfully disagree with such an assessment. With the exception of the Nordic states, which have laudably exceeded their ODA commitments, no other developed nation has managed to meet its agreed target. Further, much of the money counted by many states as ODA has at best a tangential relationship to development. These disbursements are motivated by nakedly political calculations to be used as a lever or a wedge, a carrot or a stick in the pursuance of broader geopolitical goals and alliances largely unconnected with developmental needs or priorities. Whatever the relative merits of such assistance, it is disingenuous to call it ODA in the spirit of what was contemplated by the Monterrey Consensus or the Doha Declaration. Nonetheless, by the OECD's reckoning in 2010, developed countries missed 2005's revised aid promises by over $19 billion. Further, those countries that pledged an additional $25 billion in aid to Africa fell short of that goal by a whopping $14 billion. As such, in both percentage and dollar terms, we must accept as a fact that developed states annually fail to honor their ODA commitments to the tune of multi-billion-dollar shortfalls. Financing for development will continually fail to meet its targets and objectives if we perpetuate the view that ODA is some form of discretionary charity that is meted out by altruistic donors in times of surplus. ODA is not a charity. It is an investment in international peace and security, and it is a necessary counterweight, albeit an inadequate one, against systemic inequalities in global trade and capital flows that are fundamentally unbalanced and disadvantageous to many developing countries, particularly small states. Developing countries that have spoken today to highlight the massive shortfalls between ODA pledged and ODA delivered are neither blaming nor begging. We are simply reminding our partners of the long-standing commitments that they have made, upon which we rely, and which we expect to be honored. The proper emphasis and conceptualization of ODA would also be better served by significant reforms in our global financial architecture and the voice of developing states in global governance. Today, we are told that the G20 is the world's premier forum for economic cooperation. Unfortunately, the G20's membership is devoid of states for whom ODA is a developmental necessity. It is little wonder, therefore, that the concerns of AIDS recipients are insufficiently understood and are given short shrift in G20 deliberations. The United Nations General Assembly must reassert its role as envisaged by our Charter for Economic Cooperation, and developing countries must continue to push for a greater voice in the deliberations of the Bretton Woods institutions. Mr. President, it remains a constant source of amazement that many states can regularly conjure up billions of dollars to prosecute discretionary wars and unilateral military interventions almost on a whim, while developmental assistance stagnates, falls short of commitments, and is subject to all forms of creative accounting or empty sloganeering that have no impact on the bottom lines of developing states. Mr. President, the global financial and economic crisis is not an excuse for failure to meet ODA commitments. Indeed, 2009's consensus outcome of the UN Conference on the Crisis stated that the crisis, in and of itself, necessitated urgent compliance with existing targets. In 4 decades of references to agreed ODA targets, I have not seen one instance where the target was conditioned on any calculus of economic growth or surplus. We should not now try to insert such a caveat where it has never previously existed. In an uncertain economic environment where private capital flows, foreign direct investment, and remittances are understandably stagnant or shrinking, the need for constant, predictable, and sufficient ODA is even more significant. Given its history and the repeated unconditional commitment to its achievement, the 0.7 benchmark must be an inviolable cornerstone of development financing. It is not simply another variable to be targeted in times of austerity or conflated with other additional forms of development financing that are meant to supplement but not replace previously committed assistance. Mr. President, the Caribbean sub-region is by and large comprised of small, vulnerable, middle-income, heavily indebted states. Among the 14 states of CARICOM, 5 states have debt-to-GDP ratios exceeding 100%, and an additional 4 states exceed 70%. Many countries are borrowing simply to service existing debt and pay salaries, to say nothing of pursuing pressing developmental needs. The Monterrey Consensus, the Doha Declaration, and the outcome on the UN Conference on the Economic Crisis all stress that debt relief is a critical component of meaningful development strategies. However, the predominance of so-called middle-income countries in the Caribbean sub-region has apparently dissuaded international and bilateral lenders from extending meaningful debt relief to our countries. This stance is short-sighted and ultimately counterproductive. While the debt burdens of individual CARICOM states are approaching unsustainable levels and are developmentally debilitating, our regional debt in dollar terms is comparatively small. It will cost relatively little for lenders to engage in negotiated debt relief on a regional basis with CARICOM states. St. Vincent and the Grenadines stresses the need for urgent attention to this matter. It is morally correct, fiscally prudent, and developmentally logical an approach to our region's growing debt burdens. Mr. President, finally, St. Vincent and the Grenadines would like to acknowledge and applaud the rise in South-South cooperation in the achievement of developmental goals. We have benefited greatly from such cooperation among and between developing countries and emerging economies, particularly in the pursuit of social and infrastructural investments. We stress, however, that South-South cooperation is distinct from traditional North-South donor-recipient relationship and in no way relieves developed partners from their obligations to meet their ODA responsibilities. While we are grateful for all FFD and appreciative of the efforts of all of our development partners, particularly in these times of increased global economic instability, the inescapable fact is that total ODA is far short of that which is required or promised. To paraphrase Bob Marley, the developmental pot may be cooking, but the food in that pot is not enough. Development costs money, and while many states have demonstrated an unerring ability to renege on their commitments to assist, our governments cannot similarly renege on our solemn commitments to the people-centered development and advancement of our own populations. In this time of global economic recession, the focus should not be on delaying or avoiding the implementation of FFD commitments, but rather on accelerating and strengthening those promises in the assistance of those who played no role in creating the crisis in the first place. Commitments made must be commitments kept, and Monterrey and Doha are meaningless if the understandings upon which they were based are revised or reinterpreted to the continued detriment of developing countries. St. Vincent and the Grenadines hopes that this high-level dialogue provides a meaningful opportunity for all actors in the Global Partnership for Development to recommit to urgently meeting their existing pledges, and we look forward to their imminent, if long overdue, fulfillment. I thank you, Mr. President, for your indulgence.
I thank the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines